The Eminence in Shadow Season 1 just ended quite recently, and after watching the final episode, all I gotta say is that it had a great start and a great finish. Now, I did make a video a few months ago in which I did talk about Eminence in Shadow, but I only talked about the first few episodes that came out. But now that Season 1 has ended, I can now give my overall thoughts of this series and why I think this is probably one of the best isekais to come out in modern times. Now, I think what makes Eminence in Shadow just more different than other isekais and the general isekai genre that we always see is the fact that it likes to actually make fun of some of the tropes that you see in isekai, or in some cases it makes fun of tropes that you see in other genres of anime, and that's just one of the things that makes this series unique. I think the other rest of it just comes down to good writing and good characters. One of the things that really makes Eminence in Shadow really interesting is how it was never boring to watch. There was not a single episode of this series that I felt like it was a chore to watch. Every episode has something interesting that will always come out, whether it was interesting character development or just interesting things happening in that certain episode. I know there were some people who were complaining how like the episodes were just filled with dialogue and there was nothing really going on. Even those episodes had very interesting things because, like I said, it had very interesting character moments, and it also gave us more info about the world that is Eminence in Shadow. This is kind of like reminding me of how Overlord Season 4 was structured. Remember, in Overlord Season 4, like the first half of the season, it was just mostly a bunch of setup and a bunch of dialogue happening almost every episode. Like, it wasn't towards the end in which we got to see more action and more like interesting things happening. But that is something that I didn't mind in Overlord Season 4, because with those dialogues in which they reveal a lot of information about what is the world of Overlord and how the world functions in Overlord, it became a very interesting thing to learn. And that's how I felt with these kind of episodes of Eminence in Shadow. Sure, they weren't action packed, there wasn't anything cool happening, but with the information we got in these kind of episodes, it did create a lot of world building and gave us a lot of information of what it's like to be living in the world of Eminence in Shadow. And speaking of world building, I think what also makes the world building even more better is how interesting the characters are of this series. What I really like about this series as a whole is how many interesting characters there are. I don't feel like Sid slash Shadow is the only important character in this series. I think there are so many important characters that really stand out, and to be honest, if there were just a bunch of episodes with just those characters alone, like it didn't have to focus on Sid and Shadow Garden and stuff like that, to be honest, I wouldn't really complain. That's just how interesting and how unique these kind of characters are in Eminence in Shadow. I think the characters that really stood out the most in this series alone, besides Sid and Shadow Garden, are characters like Alexia, Rose, and Iris. Those three have gotten a lot of very interesting moments, and towards the end of the season, they're the ones who got a lot of screen time and we got to learn more about them as people, which is really good to see, because a lot of isekai series tend to always have a habit of just making the main group of characters just the important characters of the series, and then they just completely brush off the other characters as if they're not really that important. And then this creates a situation in which those kind of characters could have been actually good characters and it had so much potential, but then it was completely wasted, all because they weren't the main group of characters of the series. But that's not really what happens in Eminence in Shadow, because even the side characters get their own moments. Even the side characters, we learn more about them, their backstories, why they act the way they act, why they think the way they think. It's those kind of moments that really makes the series even more interesting and you want to keep reading it or watching it. Because let's be honest, had it not had these kind of moments, I'm pretty sure nobody would really have cared about these side characters, and I'm pretty sure they also would have taken the enjoyment of Eminence in Shadow. Don't get me wrong, I'm pretty sure Sid and Shadow Garden could have carried the show, but without these moments in which we give more character development to the side characters and more screen time, I'm pretty sure some of the things that happen in the series wouldn't be that interesting, and this would have caused many of the viewers to brush it off, which would have been very unfortunate to see, because like I said, this would have created characters having wasted potential and could have brought more to the story. But thankfully that didn't happen, because Eminence in Shadow is very good at writing interesting characters. And speaking of interesting characters, let's finally talk about Sid slash Shadow, whichever name you use the most. Now, Shadow is a very interesting protagonist because I have seen so many mixed opinions over his character. On one hand, many people enjoy him because while he is overpowered and he's a character that is very hard to defeat, he's also very oblivious to the fact that all the things that are happening to him and all the things that are happening around him are very serious situations, because that's been one of the running jokes of this series. The only reason why Shadow Garden is even here in the first place and was even created in the first place was because Shadow thought that he was just making like some fantasy role play in which he gives the excuse that the reason why he created Shadow Garden was because he's going to stop this organization called the Cult of Diablos. Now, at first he thought he was just making stuff up and that wasn't going to really be a thing, but as it turns out, he was actually correct because there is an organization called the Cult of Diablos. But somehow Shadow has been able to be oblivious to this fact, so anytime something happens, he just believes that it's part of a game or it's just some kind of roleplay, when that's far from the case. Or the other reason why people like Shadow is because he has this habit of wanting to become a background character, but almost everything he says or does sometimes actually makes him the center of attention. But on the other hand, you do have a group of people who aren't huge fans of Shadow, and that's due to the fact of him being oblivious. That's one of the reasons. But the other reason is because sometimes when he tries to act cool or pretend to be like this very mysterious person, he has a habit of saying some things that many people find as cringe. I don't like using that word a whole lot, but it does make sense in this certain situation. But overall, I do understand both sides as to why they like or don't like Shadow. In my personal opinion, I think he's a very solid protagonist. Of course, I don't think he's like the best protagonist that I've seen, but in terms of how he's supposed to act and what kind of character he's supposed to be, I think he does get the job done. I wasn't really surprised when he didn't really get that much character development. Like if you compare Shadow from the earlier episodes and you compare Shadow to now, there hasn't really been a huge change to his character as of right now. Of course, that could all change in later on in this series, or maybe he has become different in the light novels. Who knows? I haven't read the light novels yet, so I don't really know, but I think that's perfectly fine. I don't think he needed to have this massive big character development or character moment in which he completely changes the way he is. No, I think he's still a very solid protagonist. Obviously, this is just my opinion, so of course I know there's going to be people having different perspectives of what they think of Shadow, but overall I think he's fine. Now moving on to the other story, and that is the story between Shadow Garden and Cult of Diablos. I think what they really did a good job is actually making that story very interesting, and you want to know more about what's going to happen between the battle of Shadow Garden and the Cult of Diablos, because even though Sid thinks it's all fake, which it isn't, I'm glad they're not just using it just for a running joke of the series. Like they're actually putting thought as to how dangerous the Cult of Diablos is and why they're dangerous and why Shadow Garden was to defeat them. So it was really good to see how they're able to balance, focusing on Sid and his shenanigans and how he's just simply doing his own thing, while at the same time proceeding with the story between the battle of Shadow Garden and the Cult of Diablos. Had they not done that, that would have made things not really that interesting to see, and I probably would have become less interested of the series, but thankfully that didn't happen because that story alone has a lot of potential, and I'm really looking forward as to what's to happen next with that story. Now moving on to pacing and animation. I remember in the first episode, many people were worried how the series was going to turn out because apparently, based on what people have said online that were light novel readers, people have stated that some of the things that they used in episode 1 were things that happened in volume 4 of the series. So because of that, some people were worried that the pacing and the way they told the story was going to be completely butchered, but that didn't happen because the pacing was good and they were actually treating the source material with respect, because from what I've been told, episodes 1 through 10 were just based on the first light novel, and episodes 11 through 20 were based on the second light novel. So it's very clear that they're not rushing the series. It's very clear that they're not cutting corners, and they're actually trying to make a good adaptation of the series. And then talking about animation, it was consistent the entire run. I know there were some people who were saying in the beginning how it looked very generic, the animation, and how it looked like your typical isekai, but in the second half it did show what they were willing to do with the animation. Like it went really hard sometimes. Like some of the things that they showed and some of the facial expressions were really clean. Even the animation, the fights were spectacular. Like it was very clear that they were trying to make really good fights, especially during the final fight between Shadow, Iris, and Beatrix. I think those fights were really good, and it shows that the studio wasn't slacking in terms of animation. I think the second half showed just how really good the animation can be in Eminence and Shadow. And in terms of the ending, I think the ending was good. I think it was a great stopping point because it clearly shows us on the ending there's still more to come, and it creates hype for the people who can't wait to see what's going to happen next in this series. Now obviously not all the characters in this ending got a very happy ending, like characters like Rose. She ended up being part of the Shadow Garden, but she's going to have to work her way up to the ranks because she's starting at 0 once again. And other characters like Iris, after she was defeated by Shadow, it's very clear that that it affected her mental state. And even Shadow got a bittersweet ending because it seems that in the end it does show that he has created a lot of enemies. That's not just the cult of Diablo. Like, we have people like Iris, there's also Sherry. Remember Sherry? She's also been doing a lot of things behind the scenes. So yeah, it seems that Shadow isn't going to have a peaceful life anytime soon now that he has created so many enemies. But that's what makes the story really interesting, as to you want to know what's going to happen next in this series. And that's pretty much my entire video. Overall, really great season. I have heard that there's going to be a stream on February 2nd in which there's going to be a big announcement involving Eminence and Shadow. It's most likely going to be a season 2 announcement just because of how popular the series has gone. Of course, it hasn't been confirmed yet, so we'll just have to wait until that stream happens and see what's that all about. But yeah, that's pretty much the entire video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.